The Cold War was a rough time. I think we can all agree on that. It really wasn't fun for anybody. Over in the West, I mean, yes, we were living in our capitalist utopia, but we were also deeply fearful of being exploded at any waking moment. And over in the East, they were living in their communist utopia. And they were also living in fear of being exploded at every waking moment. So really no one was having very much fun, is what I'm trying to say. But in particular, I do think attention should be called to Germany, Deutschland, which was split into two after World War II. When that war ended, Stalin, who was in charge of the Soviet Union, didn't actually give up any of the territory he claimed during the war, like, at all. Whereas we in America and the UK were more about liberating the other countries that Hitler had taken over, Stalin was like, I'm gonna keep these. So it became a source of very much tension regarding how to deal with Germany, because the war had ended with the Soviets pushing far into Germany, whereas the Americans and the UK, along with the other allies, pushed in from the West, therefore quite literally splitting Germany in two. Thus, Stalin maintained control of East Germany, and West Germany was liberated for the most part, with a new non-fascist government. But even more specifically, Berlin was split into two. Many people don't actually realize how weird this was, but Berlin is not in the center of Germany, it's to the east, and the city was actually nestled far behind the Soviet lines. But through some complicated negotiations that may have been largely argumentative, it was decided that Berlin itself would also be split into two within East Germany. So West Berlin became this small pocket area of filthy capitalism. And East Berlin would be, well, like everywhere else around it, communist, under control of the Soviets. This, agreement was not without its inherent problems, as really nobody in the Soviet side saw why they couldn't have the rest of Berlin, and the West was largely not about to give it up. Additionally, new problems arose once the Berlin Wall came up. See, because West Berlin was operating the way it was, controlled by the West and quite literally a thorn in the Soviet Union side, it was also kind of a life raft for people who were trying to flee from behind the Iron Curtain to the capitalist West. And this happened a lot. People would just straight up leave the Soviet territory and walk right into West Berlin. And the Soviets didn't like that. And even when they demanded the people back, usually the answer was, no. By the time the 60s rolled around, this was becoming quite a predicament for the Soviet Union because it just kind of made them look bad. They were portraying themselves as a communistic utopia where everyone was happy and everyone shared the results of their labors and it was all great and hunky-dory, and yet people were running away. So Nikita Khrushchev, who was Stalin's successor, came up with the idea to build a wall, a great big wall, right in the middle of Berlin, like a crazy person. This wall would prevent people from leaving East Berlin and going to West Berlin. And it's often thought that the Berlin Wall started out as a quite literal wall, and though it ended up that way, that actually wasn't the case. The border lockdown was relatively slow, and it started out as mostly barbed wire with guards. It wasn't a straight-up wall until quite a few years had passed since the initial idea was proposed. Either way, it just looks kind of weird, and in retrospect it almost made them look worse because, well, okay, look. Modern-day internet goers will tell you that capitalism is the source of everyone's problems, and really we should all be more like, I don't know, commies or some stuff. I know they're not that extreme all the time, but some people are. Have you been on Twitter lately? It's actually really a problem. And I'm not saying that we in the West have everything figured out, because we don't. We have problems here too. But as President John F. Kennedy put it, better than I could ever hope to, freedom has many difficulties and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. And he makes a solid point. Look, I generally don't do politics here. I do historical facts. And the fact is, Soviet Union was upsetting a lot of people, and they wanted to flee to the West. Whatever your political affiliation, I really don't care. But that's what was going on. But you may be saying, history in the dark, what about the train? So the year was 1961. Enter Harry Deterling. He was a 27-year-old train engineer working in East Berlin. He had a wife, Ingrid, and 4 sons. And he was just kind of sick of the whole communism thing. He just didn't like it. Really, he wanted to leave. But it wasn't so easy to leave, especially at that point. Immigration was largely frowned upon, and it was very, very difficult, if not impossible, for just a normal person to get up and walk out of the Soviet Union. In fact, there were many cases where people attempted to do just that and were killed. But Harry had one thing on his side. A steam engine. The Prussian T-18 was a tank engine manufactured by Prussian State Railways all the way back in 1912. 434 of the little guys were built. They were 4.64s, so pretty large by tank engine standards, but they were excellent tank engines, capable of both shunting duties as well as freight and passenger service. There's a reason they were still using them in the 60s, and in fact they wouldn't be retired until 1975. And at least 5 of them are still preserved in museums. I always liked these tank engines. They looked so industrial and well built. Very, very beefy looking engines. And frankly, locomotive number 234 was perfect for the job. Harry had worked on the railway long enough to know that they hadn't gotten around to removing the tracks in between the barrier between East and West Berlin. They were going to, but they hadn't done it yet. This is super relevant, because a lot of people hear the story and present it as if the train slammed into the solid concrete Berlin Wall, which wasn't there at that point. So, no, that's not exactly what happened here, but there was a large amount of barbed wire in the way, and you couldn't just walk over it. But there were still tracks underneath that barbed wire. The train could go through if someone dared to try. Harry planned his escape very carefully. He already planned on taking his wife and kids with him. His coal stoker, Harmut Leike, also wanted to come along. That day, Harry was in charge of pulling a passenger train, so there were a few other civilians that were along for the ride. They didn't actually realize what was going on. He chose December 5th, which was his birthday, to attempt his escape. At 8:50 p.m., Harry drove the locomotive past Albrechtshof, which was the last station in East Berlin, without stopping. The border guards had no thoughts to consider a train might attempt to break through the barrier, and Harry opened up the throttle and disconnected the emergency brake. Why did he do that? Well, the train was equipped with air brakes that anyone could pull in any of the coaches, and he was afraid someone who didn't want to just run over the Berlin Wall might attempt to do this and stop the locomotive. So he emptied all the air out of the emergency brake, which, while dangerous, prevented this exact thing from happening. Everyone ducked for cover as they made their way over the border, fearing the guards would actually shoot at the train. But contrary to popular belief, the guards never actually did that. They were likely too shocked by the situation to even consider it, and by the time they would have gathered their thoughts, the train was gone. It was traveling at 50 miles per hour. Once they were in West Berlin, one of the passengers actually called the police to explain what happened. Out of the passengers that were on board the train, 7 of them actually chose to return to East Berlin. This wasn't unusual whenever these kind of escapes occurred, as people still had families. If they weren't part of the plan, they might not be able to just up and leave the people they knew, even if they wanted to. And maybe some people didn't. That's fine, that was up to them. The East Berlin authorities also towed the train back too. They were not giving the locomotive up. And almost immediately the tracks were torn up too to prevent a similar escape from ever occurring again. And they weren't reopened until 1992, which was 3 years after the wall came down. Harry Deterling and his family, as well as the others who came with them, had a short stay in a refugee camp and then were processed and resettled. Apparently he received dozens of fan letters for his little stunt, and when reporters interviewed him after it, he said, "Freedom is my happiest birthday present." Oh yeah, good for you, Harry. I'm glad you put it that way. USA! 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 And you know what? Whenever you're on Twitter, and someone's throwing some filthy nonsense about how capitalism is the root of all evil, or whatever they're saying on today, out of their filthy, lying, commie mouths, just remind them of history, and say that freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But no one ever drove a train over a militarized wall of barbed wire in order to escape it. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.